what is going to happen to financial markets?
We need to move beyond ESG to real and tangible impacts. Global leaders talking regeneration.
We're talking unprecedented value multiples. So what is the regenerative transition, and how will it deliver greater results than the current sustainability approaches? Welcome to the next episode of the Regenerative Transition. I'm here with Dr. Jill Atkins, Professor at Cardiff University. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for asking me.
You've been a real pioneer in the space of accounting, species extinction and biodiversity accounting frameworks. Tell me, what did you see as a gap that needed these types of frameworks to be established?
Well, accounting for biodiversity is something which I think companies have been practicing really since the change of millennium. We didn't really see a lot of reporting by companies on biodiversity and species at all before, this century. And over the last 10 years, it has increased. But if you look at the academic research, including a lot of the work that I've done with colleagues, it's very much greenwash. The more you look at biodiversity reporting by companies, it's quite clear that it's all impression management, mostly impression management. And what occurred to me about 10 years ago really is that the concept of biodiversity is being a scientific concept. It's something which doesn't communicate anything really about the urgency of species extinction. So, you read about companies' biodiversity policies, companies say they're enhancing biodiversity, they have all these biodiversity policies in place, but it doesn't really tell you what they're actually doing, and it doesn't tell you whether they're actually making a difference. It's not transformative, basically. So we set up a framework which is in the academic sphere originally, and I think now it's starting to come into various other frameworks, which we called extinction accounting. And it really is extinction prevention accounting. So how can you use accounting in an emancipatory way, a transformative way, which will actually save species? And I suppose the other part of developing that framework is to use a word which communicates the problem much more clearly than biodiversity. You're looking at accounting for species loss and the prevention of species extinctions. If that answers your question.
Yeah, so I'm really interested because we see this greenwashing happening in so many types of areas, right? And I think that there's this reconciliation that needs to happen where investors or leaders in organisations don't quite know how to make these transitions without incurring great losses to their shareholders. So there's kind of split between the needs of obviously meeting certain profit expectations and then also more and more push now and mandatorization of reporting in a way that shows that they're not doing harm. So what do you think is needed in the mindset shift in order that serious transformation can start to actually take place?
I think it is happening. I think 20 years ago, the institutional investment community, for example, was just beginning to understand the linkages between financial materiality and ESG issues, as we call them now. ESG came around about 2005 within the investment community. And it's that appreciation of the financial materiality. So if we look at biodiversity, for example, as part of ESG, the E part, it's trying to identify how and why, from a shareholder point of view or from a corporate point of view, species loss damages the financial profits of a company and of the financial system. And it's communicating that. So we've written a couple of books before this. My colleagues and I have put a lot of work into trying to make it communicable to business in a very simple way why species preservation and biodiversity protection is a financial issue for business. At the end of the day, if we don't have any species, we don't have any ecosystems, we lose one species, it can destroy an ecosystem.
Particularly bees, right? We lose our pollinators, we're in big trouble.
That's right, and we wrote a whole book on that
Yeah.
in 2016.
Right.
And that book has had, I think, a significant impact on the financial community. So, for example, Hermes had a pollinator strategy, which really came out of the work we did presenting our bee ideas and communicating the financial materiality of bee decline, really,
Yeah.
and pollinator loss to the financial community. So, that's probably the easiest handle, I think, to be able to describe it. But any species you look at, actually, anything, say, in seafood, marine, the food chain, agriculture, everything is connected. And it's that interconnectedness which has become so much clearer as well with COVID-19, that people are actually saying, OK, we understand now, if we lose this seal in this part of the water, that could destroy this whole ecosystem and lead to there being no fish available for, leading into the supply chain.
Right. And we did see a big regenerative type of action in Yellowstone Park, National Park, with the attempted reintroduction of the wolves that they had killed off. Yet that learning, currently in the press now, they're talking about trying to reintroduce the wolves again back into parts of Germany, and there's big outcry from farmers. So there seems to be, even though we've had these learnings about the integrated nature of species within an ecosystem and how we need those species to create thriving of life within those ecosystems, there's still a fear or a distrust around elements of ecosystems that we consider to be desirous or non-desirous, dependent on our own interest. And how do we, shift that mindset? Because it still seems to be kind of ingrained in that we will support species kind of so long as they serve our purposes.
That's exactly right. And unfortunately, the world we live in, people are only really interested in the human race.
Yeah.
And, I think what people haven't really appreciated until now is that the future of the human race depends on the future of all of the other species around us. We've become so disconnected from nature.
Right.
And I think, one of the things I've been really interested in is the reintroduction of lynx. So lynx in Scotland, rewilding programmes. The problem is, again, it's humans making decisions on what type of ecosystem they want to see around them, or what they think nature is, rather than
And seeing themselves
nature be
almost still as
itself.
separate to it, very Cartesian concept of being separate to nature.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And, you only have to walk around London and it's completely different from the rest of the country in the sense that, there's no greenery in a lot of places. You can understand how people have become disconnected from the natural world.
Right.
And people think the natural world is a farm or, looking at farmland or pastures, and of course it isn't.
Yeah. What's interesting in the work that we've done around regeneration, we found correlations between not just disconnection from natural ecosystems, but also when you look at the gentrification in Hackney, for instance, in London, there's been a correlation between increasing gentrification and also increasing gang violence.
Yes,
And so when you're looking at not just ecological displacement, but also cultural displacement, social and physical and economic displacement, they're all kind of things that are happening through our increased urbanisation, or our lack of regenerative thinking, at least, around our urbanisation, that's leading to these, disconnects with nature.
Yeah.
And so it seems like, if the financial markets were able to really incorporate some of the frameworks that you've been developing around species and biodiversity, it then could have a ripple-on effect, right? Because a lot of these large institutional investors and banks, they're the ones that are investing in cities.
Yeah.
And investing in different types of development projects around the world. And so, what do you see needs to happen there in terms of the correlation between the markets, the adoption of the frameworks, and then following that all the way through in terms of decision making in how we do our development processes?
Well, I think it is happening, and I think one of the main issues is obviously mandatory frameworks. So the work we've been doing is obviously producing voluntary frameworks which can then be incorporated or not. So we do need government regulation. I think we need legislation. And you know, it's a human right as well. It's a basic human right to live in an ecologically healthy environment. And I think if we can start bringing those sort of legislative ideas in, that actually we have to protect ecological health and we have to protect species around us, because otherwise we're going against basic human rights. Those things I think are really important. But you know, if you look at bank lending, for example, the Equator Principles have come a long way. You know, the 2020 version of the Equator Principles has a lot on biodiversity, and they have to be applied by banks all over the world who've signed up to Equator Principles, as I'm sure you know.
Can you explain that a little bit for viewers that
Yes,
aren't
of
familiar
course.
with what that means?
It's basically a set of principles for bank lending. And I think, from what I remember, the margin is 10 million. So any investment, any capital investment that a bank makes, lends for a particular capital investment project, which is £10 million or over, they have to follow these principles. And those principles have all types of environmental standards. For example, a biological diversity audit before the building, the protection of species that are maybe endangered in that investment project. And I think if that's brought down to smaller levels as well, you know, lending smaller amounts, and you know, buildings can't be produced, new company areas can't be built without protecting ecological factors, then that's a very sure way of changing practice.
Yeah, we were talking about the Middle East before, because we're about to roll out a project in the Middle East looking at building a new tourism sector that's actually community driven. So, you know, you look at some cities in the UAE, for instance, where they've kind of bought this, like all the big shining casinos, all of the, you know, hotels and things like this, and they've defined that as tourism. And then they've encountered some of these other challenges that they didn't expect, like, you know, electricity and energy kind of crazy high rates that aren't sustainable or manageable, you know, financial challenges, and also similar types of like cultural displacement that we were talking about before, where local communities and Indigenous folks get, you know, separated out from the place in which they grew up, and they get disconnected from their ecological space. I mean, it's interesting to see now slowly talk of regeneration, because you know, the example of the UAE is kind of like you're building new industry, but you're killing the goose that laid the golden egg, so to speak, because you're wanting to regenerate something or bring life to something, but you end up creating a degenerating system.
Yeah.
And so how can the frameworks that you're talking about inform the kinds of decisions that are made at a really, really concrete level? Because sometimes when we're making decisions, we're not really making decisions from a deep understanding of a place. We're making decisions based on what we've been taught makes economic sense in terms of our ideas of scale and our idea of returns and our idea of value. So we're really talking about a rethinking of these types of things.
I think the example that you've just used is very, very good. I know, I can't remember who it was, one of my friends went to Dubai, I think it was Dubai recently,
yeah.
and said they would never go back because there wasn't a blade of grass, everything's plastic. The lakes and ponds in the city are sterile. Nothing grows anywhere. There are no insects, there's no life at all. And, you know, if you're looking at the tourism industry, who wants to go on holiday to a concrete block with nothing in
unless
it?
you want to spend loads of money on retail and
well,
some
this
folks
is
like
it,
that.
exactly. So it depends on the person. But of course, we now know there are so many studies which are linked to architecture and architectural development, which I've been reading, which say that, you know, for mental health purposes, it's essential to have nature around, whether it's gardens, you know, fish in ponds, bird song, and by cutting those off from people, particularly people living in those communities, it can actually be very, very damaging to their mental health. So architects now are working very much with ecologists and looking at biodiversity. Again, it's integrating those ideas into the heart of projects and into business strategy and decision making.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I have a colleague who works for the University of Cyprus who's looking at kind of restitution and compensation for folks that have been affected by intergenerational conflict, and was working with a group of folks in Iraq looking at, you know, what's important to them. And she said she was really surprised to see that number 3 in their top 5 was nature. It seems to keep being reiterated by humans, like when you talk about it. So there seems to be this conflict, you know, where you were talking about before. It's kind of maybe an unconscious conflict where we want ecosystems to look how we want it to look.
Yes.
And so then kind of break apart ecosystems from their natural pattern of flourishing as a result. Yet we so profoundly need connection to nature.
Well, that's
So
right.
it's like we're biting off our own arm to save ourselves in a way.
I think for me, this project, which we've been working on for a very long time now, one of the things that is so striking is that I think people think they are different from other species. And of course, we might be more intelligent, more developed in certain ways or whatever, but we're actually part of the ecosystem.
Right.
And of course, all the deep ecology books, all the theorists in that area will say that, you know, the only thing wrong with nature is the human race. And of course, what people have to understand is that if we continue the way we are, not just with biodiversity and extinctions of species, but also with climate change, then there won't be a human race, and everything will be much better from an ecological perspective, because, you know, nature will return, there'll be ecological balance, and ecological succession, of course, which I think, thinking about your regenerative ideas, to me, ecological succession is a natural process which really imitates the sort of things you've been talking about, I think.
Yeah, well, regeneration is about really designing from a living systems perspective, irrespective of the context that you are. Nature knows what it's doing.
Exactly.
We're the ones that often don't, even though we're a part of nature. It's through this disconnection. But a lot of the principles of regeneration come from our indigenous groups.
Yes.
You know, that learn to coexist and co-create with nature.
Exactly.
And that maintain this balance and harmony. And so when we're looking at deep transformation, it's like a reharmonization back to, you know, what it was naturally in our earliest versions of ourselves. So that means kind of a rethinking of value.
Completely.
Right. And so when you're looking at capital investments, what are the changes that you see needs to happen with respect to capital investments?
It's very difficult, isn't it? I mean, you know, the UK is leading, actually, in terms of looking at biodiversity. So, you know, the government released the recent reports into biodiversity and economics of biodiversity. And, you know, all this money's going into rewilding. There's a fantastic chapter in the book that we've just done by Heal, where they're using land ownership to invest directly by buying up land and rewilding in large areas of the southeast of England. But then, you know, you watch the news and they're trying to build 300,000 new homes. Everywhere you go in the UK, we drove up to Scotland last week from Wales, and, you know, the whole area is being redeveloped. There's new houses going up everywhere. And it's okay saying, oh, well, you know, this new estate's got bat boxes on the end of the roofs, or, you know, and then you see the new estates and people are putting down plastic grass. These things, there's a complete contradiction
It's
between...
a disconnect.
Total contradiction between what people think they want to see and all the good things that are happening and being done, and all the good work that people are doing to try to drive forward transformation, and then everyday life, and the fact that actually, you know, we want another 1 million homes because the population is increasing, or whatever the reason is. I'm not quite sure why we suddenly need so many more houses, you know. So we've got a complete contradiction in strategy. So in terms of investment, you know, yes, capital investment, we have to invest and we have to have growth for the economy, but trying to balance that with ecological perspectives, the only way is to have directors, for example, on boards of directors who are cognizant with ecological issues, who actually understand that by destroying biodiversity, they're actually destroying business ultimately. And there won't be a capital market.
Correct.
There won't be anything if we continue the way that we are.
And that's what we're trying to attempt to solve with the regenerative transition concept, is like really partnering with those cities, with those investors, to help them really understand nature-based design and how to design from a living systems perspective, because then you can create value, then you can create your economic value, but at the same time you're designing in partnership with all of those stakeholders that participate in that ecosystem, including your people, including your natural living systems around you. And I think that that's fundamentally missing, is it's just this top-down decision-making and policy that's then disconnected to what's really happening and what's needed on the ground. I mean, we saw this in the Sea of Cortez, right? Loreto Bay. It was, Costo said it was like one of the richest, most biodiverse regions of the Sea of Cortez in the world, and the urban planning mechanism in Loreto Bay was so degenerative that it actually started killing off the estuaries, and then regenerative practitioners had to come in and work with those communities to build a new economic model. But the economic model ended up being reversing some of that urbanization and actually having the community become stewards over regenerating that part of the Sea of Cortez and giving it new life, and they were able to build new industries out of that. So it is possible to bring those stakeholders together to create huge amounts of value, but I think the thinking, that mindset needs to be there in the first instance.
Absolutely.
So tell me about your book, because this is a really important book in terms of really, I'll hold it up so everyone can see it. It's beautiful. Puffins on the front: Extinction Governance, Finance and Accounting, Implementing a Species Protection Action Plan for Financial Markets. It's quite a title. It was edited by you and Martina McPherson, who we interviewed last month. But you cover more in this than just accounting frameworks, right? So can you tell us a bit about this book?
Well, in a nutshell, what Martina and I wanted to do as an academic and a practitioner working together was to give a sort of snapshot of where the financial markets are at the moment in terms of biodiversity. So as Martina would say, this is a biodiversity handbook. I think we discussed the title. That would be a very simple title. But as I say, the issue really is that the frameworks are around extinction prevention, and the Species Protection Action Plan is something that Martina and I launched 3 years ago, almost to the day, when we were looking at how to bring the financial markets, all the parts of the financial markets, into a more ecologically aware phase, and basically protecting species through every part of the financial markets. So whether it's pension fund investment, awareness of trustees on pension funds, different types of sustainability ratings. We've now got biodiversity ratings being produced for the first time. The last couple of years has just seen a complete take-off of initiatives in the financial markets in relation to biodiversity, and that's one of the things we talk about in here. We've got a whole chapter where we interviewed leading ESG specialists in the investment industry to basically find out, what's happening, where they think things are going. And again, COVID, I think, has had a significant impact. One of the things we talk about here is that, COVID has made people aware of interconnectedness. It seems to be possibly a biodiversity issue, highly likely a species issue, which has led to the transference, the creation of the pandemic in the first place. And I think that's really pushed biodiversity into the forefront of the financial markets, of businesses, all the way around the world. So there has been a change, and that's what we try and pick up on here. So, we finished the manuscript a while ago, but I think it's still pretty much a picture of exactly where we are, exactly what initiatives are. For example, the Rhino Impact Bond, which was launched late last year. This is the first use of a financial bond instrument to actually save a species and to increase rhino populations. And all of these types of initiatives, there's a whole chapter on extinction bonds, making a framework for the bond markets where bonds can be linked to saving different species. There's one that we call the insect apocalypse bond, for example. We are facing, at the moment, a total insect apocalypse. There's 75% of insects going extinct, effectively. Something, there's no exact figures, but, we are seeing a complete collapse of insects. And people don't like insects, you know. Everybody
I love my bees.
all their time. Yeah, I love bees.
I share my nettle flowers with my bees when I'm making tea.
This is it. But, you know, when you look at the fact that people spend all their time killing insects, whether it's spraying them in the house, spraying them in the garden, insecticides, agrochemical industry, you know, killing bees through the use of neonicotinoids, you know, it doesn't matter where you look, whether it's slug pellets, we spend all our time killing insects. And without insects, human life can't exist, and all other species will disappear because they're basically at the bottom of the food chain. And they're at the bottom of all of these ecosystems.
Yeah, they're so essential for life.
Absolutely.
So essential
critical.
for life. Yeah, exactly.
Critical.
Yeah, but you've really opened up also because you also have some quite like forward-thinking contributors there too, looking at, you know, beyond the current situation, what could be in the future. You know, I was grateful for you to include me writing about regeneration in a chapter in the book too, and you have also another range of incredible writers who are like really looking beyond the current paradigm to see what else is possible. Can you say something about some of that?
Well, we've got several sections in the book. So we have representatives from the investment industry, basically looking at how shareholders are engaging with companies directly on biodiversity issues and on species loss. That's absolutely fascinating. The level of engagement that's starting to happen, certainly with the leaders in the asset management industry.
Yeah.
So we've got lots of examples of people from, you know, Hermes, AXA, banks as well, looking at changing the way that we perceive investment. There's a fantastic small piece actually from HSBC on how they're actually changing the way you look at investment to look at investing in land, investing in nature, and just all these different initiatives. And it's absolutely fascinating to see what's happening and what potential there is. Data management services, for example, increasing equity ratings, sustainability ratings to include biodiversity and species. So it's basically, from my point of view, getting species and ecology, and particularly endangered species and ecosystems, into the very heart of every part of the financial system. Not just businesses, not just accounting, but, you know, whether it's your pension fund. You know, the disconnect, for example, between a company that says it's green and has lots of green operations, and you go and look at their pension fund, and you can find that actually their pension fund never discusses these issues at all. So, you know, it's trying to break those disconnects and get everybody on the same level, I suppose, thinking in the same way, which sounds very like what you're describing with the regenerative systems. You know, it's trying to get everybody thinking with a common purpose.
Exactly.
And not saying, oh, I'm going to go out and spend £1,000 in Harrods today, oh, and then I'll come back and water my little flowers, you know, and you know, try to encourage bees. It's that disconnect that people have.
Yeah, exactly. And we see that in corporations and a whole range of areas, not just in biodiversity and species issues, but also, you know, mergers and acquisitions and,
exactly.
and you know, attempts at like organisation transformation projects, digital transformation. We see these disconnects everywhere. So because this show is about solutions, and we've talked a lot about the frameworks, but also about what's not working, I'm really curious to see where you've seen capital markets or capital investments really shifting how they think, like concrete examples. Do you have any that you can share with us?
Well, interestingly, there's a framework which was published last March, which I co-authored, the Biological Diversity Protocol, and it's an accounting framework, but it's very significant. It's got a lot of detail. It's a framework for large businesses or small businesses to use in order to report on what they're doing to save species, to enhance biodiversity. And it's been piloted by a few companies. I can't remember the name of the company, but there's a company in South Africa which is one of the main energy generators. Mm-hmm. And it's fascinating to see the way that they've applied this accounting framework, and it's actually leading to transformation on the ground. And this is what I would call emancipatory extinction accounting, effectively. So, for example, they have a page in their report on how they've increased the number of a particular bird species, a type of heron, from 5 breeding pairs to 8 breeding pairs over the last 12 months. And that might sound very immaterial, but actually from an ecological point of view, it's a material thing.
Yes.
And it's looking at materiality not just from a financial point of view, but from the point of view of accountability for, so dual materiality, accountability for the impacts that you're having on that environment where your businesses operate.
Yeah, and that's a really big missing, isn't it?
Yes.
The accountability for how our operations impact the ecosystem within
That's
which
exactly right.
we're functioning. Yeah.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. Well, we're out of time. It's been so wonderful to have you on the show. Thank you so much for sharing all of your incredible insights. Please,
Lovely to talk to you.
Yeah, go and buy the book. It's a really, really fascinating read. It's published by Routledge. And where can people buy this?
If you just put it on the internet, they're selling it in Amazon, they're selling it from Routledge, they're selling it all the major book dealers. So
Great.
it's available.
Fantastic. Thank you. And thank you for pioneering this.
Thank
I mean,
you.
I don't know where we would be without this biodiversity and species conversation really starting to take off. Because I know I'm a bit scared, like for, the future generations, particularly with the losses that we're experiencing. So something really fundamental needs to shift. So I'm so grateful for the work that you've been doing.
Well, Martina and I have dedicated the book to our children.
Yeah. And thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next month for the next episode of the Regenerative Transition.